Good evening, everyone. Guess we'll get started here. I'd like to welcome you all to the third and final event in the City Talks lecture series for fall 2022 on the theme of climate change and energy transitions in the city. My name is Ruben Rose Redwood, and I'm the Associate Dean Academic in the Faculty of Social Sciences, as well as a professor in the Geography Department at the University of Victoria. And I'm also the chair of the UVic Committee for Urban Studies, which organizes the City Talks. I'd like to begin by first acknowledging that this event is taking place on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen peoples, as well as to acknowledge the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. I'd also like to acknowledge the financial support of the Faculty of Social Sciences, the Faculty of Engineering and Computer Science, the Department of Civil Engineering, and the Department of Geography at the University of Victoria, as well as, not to forget, the Legacy Art Gallery, which is one of our co-sponsors now as well. Now, it's my great pleasure, in fact, to introduce tonight's speaker, David Miller, who is the Managing Director of the C20 Center for City Climate Policy and Economy. Mr. Miller was mayor of the City of Toronto from 2003 to 2010, and served as chair of the C20 Cities from 2008 to 2010. He's a leading advocate for the creation of sustainable urban economies, and has held a variety of public and private positions, and served as Future of Cities Global Fellow at the Polytechnic Institute of the New York University from 2011 to 2014. And he's also the author of the book Solved: How the Great Cities of the World Are Fixing the Climate Crisis, published by the University of Toronto Press. He's also currently here at the University of Victoria as an executive in residence in the business school. And so we're delighted to have him here tonight. And his talk will be on climate change. While nations talk, cities act. So with that being said, let's give David Miller a nice warm welcome to the City Talks tonight.
Is that okay?
That should work nicely.
Nobody has ever had a problem hearing me. They may have heard things they didn't want to hear, but they've had no problem with the volume. First of all, thank you very much, everyone, for coming out tonight to hear my thoughts about climate change, which is an unbelievably urgent challenge. I'm optimistic and hopeful, but that hope is getting very much near the end, and I'll explain why in the talk. The part that gives me hope, though, is the potential and the real action of leading cities around the world and the example they're setting for everyone. And essentially, my belief is that because in order to address climate change, we have to act really quickly. By 2030, we have to have overall global emissions, which is quite extraordinary. My belief is to do that, you have to take the best things that are being done now somewhere and do them everywhere. We can't wait for new inventions. We need to act on what we know. And the good news is there's so much happening in cities. And if we can take those best ideas and do them rapidly everywhere, we've got a chance. Less of a chance perhaps today than when I wrote my book, which was only 2 years ago, but we've got a chance. And I really very much fundamentally believe in cities, city governments, and the opportunity through cities, which is a very long way of saying I do want to acknowledge City Councillor Matt Dell, newly elected, who's with us tonight. Councillor, thanks very much for being willing to stand for office and for showing up tonight as well. So that's what my talk's going to be about, and there'll be lots of time for questions at the end. When I was in office in Toronto, my staff always told me that the best part of my speeches was the question and answer session, which I sort of thought, why are you making me speak in the first place? But so I think everyone in this room, you wouldn't be here if you didn't recognize how urgent climate change is, but we're seeing the impacts today. The impacts are serious. They hurt those that have the least. Floods in Pakistan being a very significant example. But it's not just between the global north and the global south, although that matters, because the global north collectively has really created the problem of climate change. And the impacts are being felt significantly, not just here, but significantly in the global south. But even within cities and countries in the global north's rich countries, there's an incredible inequality to the impact of climate change. So Hurricane Sandy in New York City, for example, which had a massive impact. It shut down Wall Street. People were killed. Whether it was a climate change storm or not is debatable, but it's the kind of thing that's going to happen more and more. Wall Street, they took about a month to clean up, the heart of the global financial sector. Queens, which is a neighborhood full of low-income, working-class immigrants to the United States, bring their hope and dreams and their families to that country. You know, inside of the Statue of Liberty, it took 7 or 8 years to clean up. And it still has wood sewers, by the way. And to me, that illustrates so fundamentally why we have to act on climate change. It's not just because of the impact on nature. It's not just because of the impact on humanity, although it's incredibly serious. Look how difficult it was for the world to handle a few million refugees from Syria. Think of what will happen if there is crop failure of the scale that's predicted if we get up over 2 degrees warming, and you have hundreds of millions of people on the move in Africa alone. What will happen? How will we be able? Come on in. Come on in. How will we be able to cope with that? But we also there's a moral urgency to acting because of this incredible inequality and the impact on the least well-off. So, what do we know from the reports? We can still reach 1.5 degrees, or at least hold overall global average temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, but it's a very closely run thing. That's what the most recent report says, but there are other scientists who say it's too late. It's a very, very closely run thing. And to do it, we have to have emissions by 2030 globally. That's definitely the case to have any hope whatsoever. And you know, the good news, if there is that economically the world would be much better off if it actually acts. Unfortunately, as we all know, politically it's been very difficult to get action because there are some places and some sectors who see themselves as being hurt more than benefiting from climate action. So that's the picture. We're almost at 1.5 degrees. That's a tipping point. The science is serious. Economically, we can afford to do this, but we're not. Now, what's the relevance of cities? Well, first of all, the world today is urban, and it's increasingly urban. And that is a relatively recent phenomenon. About 2008, 2009, it doesn't really matter, so I haven't exactly looked it up, but about that time. So about 10, 15 years ago, for the very first time in human history, the world became predominantly urban. So from the dawn of human civilization until just before 2010, we were a predominantly rural world, and now we're predominantly urban. And that trend is accelerating and increasing. Why? Because of the huge megacities in China and India and the mass migrations to urban areas in places like Latin America and Africa. So the world is urban, it's getting increasingly urban, and not surprisingly, that's also where the emissions are. Most of the world's people, most of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, depending who studies, 70%, 72%, again, it doesn't really matter, it's most. Most of the world's economy, most of the world's energy are all in our urban areas. So if that's where the problem is, that's also where we should look for the solutions, which only makes sense. And the good news is that globally, there was a coalition of mayors who worked for the C40 who are demonstrating significant leadership in the fight against climate breakdown. I should just mention that organization was founded by then London Mayor Ken Livingstone in 2005. And it was his view at the time that national governments were failing to recognize the urgency of acting on climate change. So he called up 20 mayors from G20 countries and said we should form a C20, Cities 20, to force national governments to act. And his vision from the beginning was that the mayors of the world's major cities can use their voices and their actions to help the world avoid climate breakdown. When he called us, we said to him, you know what, you probably don't just want the capitals of the G20 countries. You don't necessarily want Ottawa and Washington. You actually want the really big cities like New York, Los Angeles, Paris, Jakarta, and Toronto at that time. Montreal and Vancouver are now members as well. So that's how the organization ended up being formed. It's 40 cities globally, 20 from the global north, 20 from the global south, based on the premise that the voices and the actions of those mayors could help the world avoid climate breakdown. It's now nearly 100, kept the same name, but it's the same premise. And the idea is that these cities have the political heft and the mayors have the bully pulpit to not just persuade governments to act, but to showcase actions that can make a very real difference and then help those actions spread at pace and scale. And there's been some notable successes. I'll speak to some of them. And that's why the thesis of my book is we need to do more of that. Take those actions, spread them as quickly as we possibly can globally to ensure that we do what's needed to by 2030. Now the context for this is something called the Climate Tracker. It's a not-for-profit organization that tracks government action. When I had this slide last year, there was actually one country, the Gambia, in the green, who was meeting their targets. They aren't anymore. There is no national government anywhere in the world that is meeting its climate targets, no matter what it says. Nobody. Including Canada. And we have a government that in a way got elected in climate change. 2 elections ago was a climate change election. The Liberal Party, the Democratic Party, the Bloc Québécois, and the Green Party obviously all stood for climate action, and the Conservatives said no. And those parties got a significant majority of the votes. And we're saying the right things as a country, but we're not doing them, and we're certainly not doing them at the pace and scale needed. So there's from my perspective, there's a very significant contrast with what cities are committing to do, trying to do, and doing, and the national governments who aren't. Now they're meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt right now. If you've been following the news, nothing really good is coming out of COP27. And to me, the concept even of COP27 is a bit shocking, because these COPs, they're conferences of the party under the United Nations climate agreements, and they've been going on for 28 years. 1 year was missed in COVID. So for 28 years, national governments have been meeting to try to get agreement on binding strategies to address a globally significant problem that could potentially harm hundreds of millions of people. And they've been having those conversations for 28 years. Councillor, you're going to discover very quickly that in municipal politics, you don't have 28 years to solve a problem. People quite reasonably expect you to address it quickly and in meaningful ways. And that's one of the reasons, from my perspective, why cities are a hotbed of innovation around climate, because that's what municipal governments, mayors and councillors get elected to do, is solve problems, to work with people to address them, and to make change and to address problems. And if they don't do it, at the next election, people invite somebody else to do it. And we've certainly seen some of that in BC recently. So that's what's happening right now. Last year in Glasgow, from my perspective, that was probably the last best chance for national governments to make the commitments necessary to avert a climate crisis. And those commitments include things like financing adaptation in low-income countries. You know, if you heard I think it was the president of Pakistan, but it might have been one of the cabinet ministers, when the flooding was happening, he was saying, you caused this. We're the victims. And we need your help for you to pay for the loss and damage that our people are suffering. That's a big topic of discussion. How national governments are actually going to have a path to honor the commitments they made in Paris at COP21, which was the one moment where there actually was agreement. The agreement was insufficient, and everybody knew it, because it said the target is 2 degrees. It said there's a higher ambition of holding to 1.5. At the time, everybody knew the science said 1.5 was the required target, but people were so justifiably excited that there actually wasn't agreement. The belief was that 5 years later in Glasgow, nations would come together and do more. 1.5 degrees became accepted in Glasgow as the goal, but national governments really avoided making the commitments they needed to make to get us onto that trajectory. And I've got some thoughts about how cities mattered on the 1.5 degrees, which I'll come back to in a little bit later. So this is a bit of a busy slide, but it's essentially saying, here's what's going on, here's where we are, here's where we need to be. And if you look at it, basically, we're nowhere near where we need to be, which is the gray at the bottom. And the middle is pretty optimistic, 1.7 to 2.6, because that assumes the national governments are all going to do everything they've said they would do as quickly as they've said they would do it. And we know from our own case in Canada how unlikely that is, even with a well-meaning government in Ottawa that believes in these issues. The one, I think, light there is the United States with the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think President Biden deserves, and Speaker Pelosi deserve huge credit for getting that through, because it's actual money on the ground to help change the way the U.S. creates and uses energy. So, you know, as you can see, the drop we need to do is incredibly dramatic collectively. And there's a gap in what nations have committed to. These are called NDCs, nationally determined contributions. UN language sometimes is a little bit Byzantine. Oh, and by the way, why have we taken 27 conferences, 28 years? It's partly structural, because the UN process respects each country as of equal value as it should. But what it means in a process like this, there has to be consensus. And so if you have a government, like current government of Russia, let's say, that wants to not agree to climate goals, it's very easy for them. And unfortunately, as Canadians at COP15 in Denmark, our government at the time didn't want to see consensus. And what it did was what happens in these UN negotiations, if you don't like the text, you put brackets around it, and it gets held for discussion. So what our government did was bracket almost anything it could, like the. You know, we don't think there's a the in this sentence. It should be an is. But you do enough of that, and the time runs out. And that's what happened in 2015. And I think this is structurally one of the reasons why the national governments can't come to agreement, which is different than cities. Because cities, we don't have to have everybody. We have as many as we can get and really drive action and consensus. So here's some of the things the national governments said in Glasgow. And if you look at these closely, for example, saving forests, ending deforestation, fantastic. I agree we should end deforestation. Where's the plan? Where's the action? What are they actually doing to do this? And the answer is, these were press conferences with no plans or actions whatsoever. Now, my slides have gotten slightly out of order here, so bear with me. We had IT issues today. Has anybody here ever had IT issues? No, it's only me, isn't it? So working off a Mac and translating into a non-Mac seems to have changed things a bit. So there's some positive things that happened in Glasgow, and I want to speak to those because they're from a city's perspective. So unlike the national governments who said we're going to end deforestation, cities came and said, what can we do to create real action and change? And the first thing, C40 and some other cities organizations took the ideas that are behind what C40 is doing, and I'll speak to those in a second, and recruited over 1,000 cities and towns to make the same commitment. And the commitment is to doing your fair share of overall global halving of emissions by 2030 on a path to net zero by 2050. Now, there's a whole debate about net zero. I have to talk about that in the questions afterwards. But essentially, what C40 and some allies did was make real the idea that when a big city makes change, others can follow by recruiting another 1,000 cities and local governments to take part of that. And those cities and local governments had to say, as being part of the race to zero, that we will have a climate plan. It will do our fair share of halving by 2030 on the path to net zero by 2050. And they had to name the areas that they were going to work in to actually do that. And within 2 years, they have to have their plan and specific actions, otherwise they'll be disinvited from the city's race to zero. And that's based on a program that C40 mayors brought in 1 year after Paris. So a year after national governments agreed on 2 degrees, with knowing that science is 1.5 and that was a higher ambition, the C40 cities had their next summit in Mexico City. And the chair at the time was Mayor Paez of Rio. And he said to the executive director of C40, an Englishman named Mark Watts, he said, Mark, what do we need to do in order to ensure our nearly 100 members, the world's biggest cities, representing city regions of somewhere between 700 and 800 million people, and somewhere between 20 and 25% of the world's economy. So very significant potential for action. And what do we need to do? Mark's answer was, we need all of our mayors to commit to having a 1.5 degree compliant plan. And the mayors voted that. They voted through their steering committee to have an obligation of membership for C40. All cities have to have a 1.5 degree compliant plan, which includes their fair share of halving by 2030 on the path to net zero by 2050, and they have to be acting on it. And that required in the global north cities to peak emissions by 2020. So the program was called Deadline 2020. And the good news is that most of those cities have honored that obligation. They're taking significant action. Greenhouse gas emissions are coming down. The bad news is C40 cities as a group are not quite on track to have emissions by 2030. They're close, but not quite on track. And that's because a few cities haven't yet honored that obligation, particularly global south cities whose ability to do things like create a climate plan was severely impacted by the pandemic. However, if they don't have one and don't start acting on it, they will be invited to leave the organization because it's a criteria of membership. But one of the things that program did was say to the world, these governments who are like a very large country representing city regions, 700, 800 million people, 20 to 25% of the world's economy, if they can commit to 1.5 degrees, so can national governments. And there are other activists, particularly young people, who really push national governments, but I'm firmly convinced that the diplomatic efforts of these mayors using their voices because of their actions helped change the international debate. So it's no longer 2 degrees that national governments are ignoring. They're at least ignoring the right thing. It's a pretty modest achievement, but very important, because it allows us as civil society to hold those national governments to account to the right target. It's extremely important in why the voices of mayors matter. Second thing that happened was this breakthrough allowed for spin-offs. So for example, one of C40's funders is a Danish foundation called Real Dania. So Real Dania, their mission is to make better cities. It's a quite interesting foundation. It'll be fantastic if we had one in Canada, I think, of this magnitude. But that's their mission. And they support C40 in part to learn. And so they took our deadline 2020, and now 94 cities and towns in Denmark have 1.5 degree compliant climate plans, and they're taking the actions necessary to undertake them. Now, why is this possible? It's possible because not only are the majority of emissions in cities globally, 70%, 72%, most of them are in 4 areas. How we heat, cool, and build our buildings, so buildings, transportation, and there's a synergy between the two, of course, depending on how you build your city. How we manage our waste, and in many African cities, that's the single biggest contributor to climate change because of informal waste management practices that leak methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas, and how we generate our electricity. Now, in British Columbia, we're pretty good on electricity, obviously. It's a very, very clean grid. But many cities are in places where the grid isn't clean. And those 4 areas are all areas that cities are they using direct power or the bully pulpit of the city and of the mayor can make really significant change. Buildings, transportation, waste management, and electricity. And there's some really exciting things happening. Globally about this. First of all, at Glasgow, a coalition of cities, construction companies, and unions, actually, the International Woodworkers of the World, committed to tackling emissions from construction. So this is really significant because one of the things, in order to build in a way that is zero emissions, you need to change supply chains and change the thinking of suppliers. The City of Vancouver is actually doing this through the Vancouver Economic Development Commission because they have very aggressive goals for reductions of greenhouse gases in construction and building operation. So the Vancouver Economic Commission is working with suppliers like window manufacturers to try to help them change the way they manufacture in order to meet the city bylaw under the building code. Really important, and C40's created an accelerator to help do the work to think about how we actually do this. Much, much more to say about buildings. And I think one of the interesting things about buildings that I found surprising when I first learned it is in most cities, how we heat and cool buildings is the single biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. It's not transportation unless you're a very spread out city like Houston. It's actually the buildings. New York City around 70%. It's down because of steps they've taken that I'm happy to talk about in the question period. Toronto, it's about 60%. Victoria, I don't know, I'd guess about 40, but it's very likely that it's the biggest contributor. And that's good because it's actually pretty straightforward from a technical perspective to dramatically reduce the amount of polluting energy used to heat and cool buildings very quickly. And that's one of the reasons why there's still a tiny bit of hope that we can keep to 1.5 degrees and have emissions by 2030 because of the opportunities for change in buildings, electrification, much more. So, second thing, transportation. London is fascinating to me what Mayor Khan's done, and also what Mayor Livingston did with the congestion charge. Are people familiar with Mayor Livingston's congestion charge? No? So I say a couple, some nods, some no's. So Mayor Livingston basically brought in toll to central London, which, as you can imagine, some people didn't like. And I've forgotten what the level was at that time, but it was something like £10 to drive into central London. Oh, by the way, in between Mayor Livingston and Mayor Khan, there was a mayor of London who didn't support these kinds of initiatives, and his name was Boris Johnson. Interesting. I have some stories about Boris, but I perhaps won't be sharing them on a public podium. But so Mayor Livingston brought that in, but what he did was very smart. He first of all said to the people of London, we have a terrible problem with congestion. You can't get into central London. Our buses can't get into central London. So we need to solve that problem to make your lives better. And yes, we're going to ask you to pay, but it's going to work. And what I'm going to do to make sure it works is we're going to use all of the proceeds to buy new buses. So what Mayor Livingston did in one stroke was fundamentally change the transportation network in London from one where cars, despite the excellent public transit, were being increasingly relied on, back to one where you could rely on excellent public transit by investing more in it, using the proceeds of the congestion charge. Very effective, helped lower emissions, helped make traffic better. Over time, particularly because Mayor Johnson didn't really support it, started to creep up. So Mayor Khan has greatly expanded this zone. And what he's done, I think, is really interesting because he started from a different perspective. He didn't start from the perspective of climate, although he always talked about it. He didn't start from the perspective of transportation and congestion. He started from the perspective of health. And he said, in fact, if you go look at his Twitter feed right now, if Twitter still exists, does it still exist? Yes, okay, good. We're 50-50 on that. He started from the perspective, the air in London is so polluted that our children have extraordinary rates of asthma, and in order to address that, we need to dramatically reduce the emissions from vehicles coming into this city. And that was the justification for expanding the zone. Ken Livingston's was really downtown. This is called ultra-low emissions zone because it both lowers the emissions and it's a much bigger zone. And I happened to be in London at meetings for work when he brought this in. It was pre-COVID. And so I watched on BBC. And it was fascinating because Mayor Khan spent a year talking about health before they did this. And the BBC interviewed a delivery truck driver who said, I don't want to pay £10 to come into London. And you could hear the tone of voice in your head, so I'm sure. And then they went and interviewed the headmistress of a school. And they were talking to her about children's health. They said, what's that on the wall behind you? And she very casually said, oh, that's the asthma rack. Those are the children's puffers. And there were dozens and dozens and dozens of puffers on the wall in the school lobby. And that was the end of the issue. Mayor Livingston got re-elected after bringing in the first congestion charge. I believe because he changed transit for the better and made it easier for people to get around. Mayor Khan got re-elected after bringing in the ultra-low emission zone and has expanded it again since. And I believe it's because people understood the connection between the health of their children and climate change and needing to accept this program. And one of the things that I think is interesting about that is, London's got quite unique circumstances. But if you think about those two underlying principles, how do we address emissions from transportation in ways that make people's lives better, which is what Ken Livingston did, and how do we address emissions from transportation that make people's lives better through better health? Those are principles that you can apply anywhere, large or small. And it may not be about tolls. It might be about bike lanes. One of the reasons Jill and I love Victoria is we decided a number of years ago to get rid of our car. We have no car. And now it's convenient. We live in Cook Street Village. We can walk and cycle everywhere. We don't, we're not outside the city, but we can walk and cycle everywhere, and it makes us healthier, happier. We're not angry all the time when we're stuck in traffic, and we save about $1,500 a month. What's not to like? And I think those kinds of propositions are ways to win the argument on climate anywhere. The solutions might be a little bit different, but the lesson from these two mayors is make it easier and healthier for people to live, and they'll support the measure, and by the way, you'll get re-elected. The other thing about cities is the ability of cities and mayors to use their bully pulpit even when an issue isn't directly within their responsibility. And you have to pick your moments. You can't do it on everything. But there are moments you can. So, no city runs shipping corridors. No city has a mandate over the fuel that shipping companies use. And by the way, it's terrible fuel. It's really bad. But Los Angeles runs its port. And the Los Angeles to Shanghai shipping corridor is the busiest shipping corridor in the world. So the mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, who's a fabulous, fantastic, effective, and charismatic person, spoke to the Shanghai government and started the process of trying to build the world's first green shipping corridor. And through collaboration and strategic use of their voices, they actually created it. Now, it's starting very modestly. It's starting with one ship. As you can imagine, there's more than one ship going between those two ports. But this was announced about a year ago, and in Egypt, last week, it was announced that there is significant new work on green shipping, including companies like Maersk, the world's biggest container company. And that all happened because these cities made the breakthrough. And they empowered the industry to take a good hard look at itself by using their voice and their actions, even in areas they didn't have jurisdiction. And if you pick your moment, you can be highly effective. Some other things that have been happening using that same philosophy, the divestment movement has been around for a long time. There are people in this room who I'm sure are about the same age as me who will remember when we fought about divestment in South Africa, and that we needed to force our entities to divest, like university pension funds, to put pressure on the South African government to end apartheid. And I remember thinking, apartheid's never going to end, but this was the right thing to do. And all of that pressure ended up working, of course. While there's a huge divestment movement around fossil fuels, it didn't really get anywhere from my perspective until New York and London. New York Mayor Bill de Blasio and Mayor Khan from London said, we're going to divest. We have responsibility over significant pension funds, and we're going to divest. Now, it's very complicated because mayors don't run pension funds, pension trustees do. And they have a fiduciary duty to the beneficiaries. So you can't just say, we like this political platform, we're going to do it. But they found a way to ensure that trustees could honor their fiduciary duty and still divest from fossil fuels. And to me, that was the breakthrough that then started all these others, like Harvard University finally caved into its students, embarrassingly slowly, University of Toronto equally embarrassingly slowly, but the issue started to move because of these two mayors, arguably doing something that was outside their direct powers and authorities. Final area where this is happening is energy, where C20 Cities are working not just when they control the energy grid, which some of them do. Los Angeles Department of Water and Power is the electric utility in Los Angeles. City of Toronto owns Toronto Hydro, which is the distribution utility. But many cities don't. And there are fascinating examples of cities using their purchasing power to completely change the energy grid, and particularly in Sydney and Melbourne in Australia, where the system, as I understand it, is basically privatized, at least the generation part of it. And what the mayors did in both cities, they pursued similar strategies. And they're a bit like Victoria. They've lots of smaller places in a regional district. They got the region on side, and then they worked with big institutions like hospitals, and in Melbourne's, well, both of their case, the Transit Authority, and they went to the private sector and said, well, we're not going to buy your electricity anymore unless it's clean. And we'll sign a long-term contract if you build clean energy. And there's now huge solar and wind that supplies both Melbourne and Sydney, and the grids are on their way to becoming clean. Los Angeles, where they do control it, when Mayor Garcetti was first elected, had something like 30% of the electricity was coal. By 2031, it will be completely clean as a result of decisions he and his council took to make investments in clean energy because they could do it directly. But both pushes, both the indirect and the direct, are resulting in really significant change. Yes, we're lucky in BC, we're lucky in Ontario, we've got pretty clean grids, but most places don't. And cities are showing how to make that change and that it's possible. Those were all some things that related to what happened at COP, and I really, in Glasgow, and I really wanted to draw out what cities were doing in Glasgow and talking about while national governments weren't doing much. We're talking about things like deforestation without a plan. And one other thing that the cities did was work collectively to create a huge fund, $1 billion fund, private investment, to help Latin America transform its bus fleets from diesel to electric. Electric buses are cheaper to run than diesel, but they're more expensive to buy. So you need some capital at the beginning. And the Latin American systems are very strange. They're often franchised, and the people who have the franchise actually make their money off the maintenance, not off the bus, and so they don't want to go to buses that don't need much maintenance. But so the city said, well, how do we do this? We need the financing. And got private sector commitments for $1 billion. And there is an electric bus revolution going on in Latin America right now. It's really quite remarkable, led by Bogota and Santiago in Chile. Really significant change. That'll happen in Glasgow. This is some work that's happening now, and I think it's really interesting because if you take the idea that a city or a town needs to have a climate plan, and the climate plan will probably focus on those 4 areas of buildings, transportation, waste management, electricity, possibly food as well, really important, particularly local food production. How are you going to ensure that that climate plan works? Well, one of the things in these climate plans, you measure your emissions, and then you measure yourself against, are you lowering them? And that's typically for the geographic area, not just the city. Direct responsibilities. But in the city direct responsibilities, how are you going to ensure that you're making change? Well, what Oslo is doing, and Tshwane in South Africa, Mayor Randall Williams, is what they call a climate budget. So there are well-known proceedings in city halls, everybody understands it in the public service, of how you do a financial budget. You may get the money you're asking for or not, that's up to council, but the public service knows what to do. And what Oslo and Tshwane have done is say, all right, you need money if you want to build a new curling rink, for example, for those fabulous Norwegian curlers with the amazing trousers. I guess there's not many curling fans here, but they have amazing trousers, okay, trust me. If you want to build a new curling rink, you need to get a financial allocation, but you also need a carbon allocation. And this is how much carbon we've got as a city that we, within our direct jurisdiction, we're allowed to emit as part of our climate plan. And you've got to have a budget for that. And if you don't have it, you can't do it. And they're applying that to all areas of city operations. And it's really quite remarkable. My understanding is that Victoria last year had a little bit of a pilot in trying to do this with the roads department. And it's an idea that can spread everywhere. Not just cities, not just big cities, not just towns. Perfectly within the ability of a business to do that. Businesses have financial budgets. A business can analyze and say, how much emissions can we emit in order to stay within what's appropriate to be part of having overall global emissions by 2030. And it could hold its teams to account, the same way it does financially, for that carbon. And not only businesses, but there's no reason why federal or provincial government couldn't do this. Couldn't say, what's our share of carbon if Canada is going to keep to its commitments, and we're going to do our share of keeping overall average temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. Why can't we have a climate budget? And to me, this is very similar to when cities 6 years ago said 1.5 is right. It's real, it works, and it works because the same people that are administering the money are administering the carbon. It's done by the finance department, so the whole city government has to be involved. A couple more thoughts that I think are relevant to Victoria in particular, one of which is transportation, buildings, all come together in how we think about the growth of our city and how it's going to change over time. You know, housing is a big issue in Victoria, it's a big issue in Toronto, it's a huge political issue in Ontario right now, and how and where you build housing connects, of course, to your transportation network and what you want to do around transportation. And from my perspective, the more we ensure that cities are dense enough to allow people to be able to walk, cycle, or in Victoria's case, take a bus to meet their everyday needs, the more those cities are going to be low carbon cities, and they're actually better places to live, which means densifying, which means fighting sprawl. Some people call this idea the 15-minute city. It's fine, it doesn't have to be called that. But that concept, under different names, is being used in all these cities around the world. And it's highly effective for the same way that what Mayor Livingston and Mayor Khan did worked, because people actually live better lives when you build a city like that. The air's cleaner, it's easier to get around, you've got all your needs met in your local neighborhood. Sort of like living in Cook Street Village. I think we won the lottery on that one. But, so sprawl's bad. That's the other message from that. So a couple more points, then I'll take questions. First of all of these cities, or at least all the ones that did a really good climate plan, started with the idea that within their cities there are inequities that unless their climate plan addresses them, the climate plan won't work. A, because it won't be right. B, because it won't meet the needs of the people. And this is Mayor Garcetti from Los Angeles. Their plan systematically engaged people in low-income neighborhoods and said to them, what do you need? And what do you need in your neighborhood? Well, near the port of Los Angeles, they said the air is terrible here because of all the diesel trucks. What can you do about that? Some other neighborhoods, they said, we want to access solar, but it's too expensive. What are you going to do about that? Our kids need jobs. What are you going to do about that? How come only rich people drive electric cars? What are you going to do about that? And so the climate plan addressed all of those things as well. There's a job training program for young people to install solar. There's subsidies for low-income people. They have a program called Blue LA, which is like Moto, except it's all electric vehicles, and it's subsidized for low-income people in low-income neighborhoods, so they can actually access electrified transportation, clean transportation in their own neighborhood. And this principle is repeated again and again and again in the very best climate plans, because equity is inextricably linked with this issue. Now, how does this all come together? I do want to speak to Toronto, and I left this to the end because I don't like saying I'm from Toronto, I'm here to help you, but it's not received very well anywhere, even in Toronto. Toronto had a climate change plan in 2007. It was renewed, supposed to be renewed 5 years later. It wasn't. It was renewed 10 years later in 2017. Progress is stalled now, by the way, but it's a political issue from my perspective. But Toronto's plan addressed all of those areas we talked about. Buildings, there were numerous programs in buildings, public, private, creating an internal fund within the city administration to do energy retrofits on city buildings. And as the energy savings came in, those departments paid the money back, so like internal loans. programs to assist residents, voluntary programs with the private sector, deep lake water cooling, which took all the air conditioning off the electricity system and put it on using cool lake water through a heat exchanger. And at the time, the electricity used on hot summer days came from a coal-fired power plant. So it was big reductions. Lots of exciting stuff. Most important thing in some ways was the climate plan said we need a transit plan, which became called Transit City. And for those of you who know Toronto, this map of the Transit City lines should be familiar. The currently existing subways, the Bloor Danforth line and Yonge University, now unwisely called 1 and 2, but I digress, are the grey lines. And the Transit City lines, which are light rail at grade, are the coloured lines. And they were designed for a variety of reasons, but it started in the climate plan. And so there was a climate aspect because the city recognized that without proper transit, you cannot transform a city to be climate friendly. So that was the first reason. Second reason was a transportation reason. The Bloor line and the Yonge line are fantastic, but most of the city doesn't have direct access to rapid transit. So you need a network. And if people are truly going to leave their car at home, they need to know that there's a transit network. So whatever, if they change their mind during the day and go somewhere else, they can still get home. So this created a network in all areas of the city. The third thing it did was the city had an explicit goal to intensify and welcome development into the city to stop sprawl-based development, which has all sorts of negative consequences everywhere, but certainly in southwestern Ontario. Class 1 farmland disappearing, massive traffic jams, air quality issues, climate contribution. So the idea was, if you build rapid transit, you could create significant density around that transit and grow inside Toronto instead of continuing to sprawl outside the farms. And another thing it did, because of the way the plan was built, was explicitly address equity. That was both intentional, but also a byproduct of the fact that to build the transit network, or at least decide where the lines were, two things were looked at. The official plan, which guided development, which said, where can you put new buildings? And secondly, the busiest bus routes that didn't have rapid transit. And who uses the bus in a big city like Toronto? Predominantly, it's low-income people. Middle class and upper middle class people still use the subway and the streetcars, but buses are predominantly low-income people. So what the Transit City plan did by design was provide rapid transit to the lowest income neighborhoods in Toronto because it was being built where the busiest bus routes are. And if you see the other chart, it's called priority neighborhoods. And I'm sorry, I don't technically know how to get these to be one slide. It would be much better if I could, but I don't. You can see what a priority neighborhood is, priority investment neighborhood. City Council did a study with the United Way, with the provincial government, federal government, and said, what neighborhoods have the biggest correlation between low incomes and a lack of historic investment in public services? So where are people worst off and still have no access to libraries, community centers, job training programs? They are a priority for this council for investment. And if you look at these two charts, you'll see the new Transit City lines served uncannily directly all of those priority neighborhoods, which of course isn't a surprise given the way the lines were developed. But what it did was bring rapid transit to the least well-off so people could be included in the fabric of the city. And the first two lines, Shepherd and Finch, had really significant public consultation programs. And I went out one morning, I had an assistant in my office named Clive, who lived in Malvern, which is sort of above the east in Shepherd East, for those of you who don't know Toronto. So we met at Clive's house at around 5 o'clock in the morning and took the bus down from Malvern, across Shepherd, and ultimately we ended up at York University. By the Shepherd bus, there was a woman who'd been on the Malvern bus, and I went over and I had this glossy brochure about the Shepherd East LRT, and I said to her, well, she said to me actually, Mayor, what are you doing on my bus at 6 o'clock in the morning? And I said, I've come to talk to you about the Shepherd East LRT. And she said, what's that? And I said, well, an LRT is kind of like an above ground subway. It runs on its own rails in the middle of the street. It's separated from traffic, so it doesn't get stuck in rush hour traffic. So the service will be much more reliable and much faster than the bus. You'll get going where you need to without delay. Where are you going? She said, work. Where do you work? I work at Pearson Airport. Pearson Airport is about 40 kilometers from where she started out. How do you get to Pearson? She said, well, I take this to the Shepherd subway, and then I take the Young line, and then I take the Finch bus, and then I take the Moulton bus. So that's a lot of connections. And she said, how long does it take you? She said, 2 hours if I make my connections, and in the winter the service is unreliable. I said, you have a long day. So that's my morning job there. In the afternoons, I'm a cleaner at the Royal York Hotel. Okay, so that's bus, subway, bus. Now, that one, the Shepherd East LRT, by the way, started construction and got stopped. It was a topic of huge political debate. And guess who was not involved in that debate? That woman. Because she was stuck on the bus. And this rapid transit would literally save her enough time in the day to be able to potentially go to public meetings if she wanted to, or maybe be home with her kids for dinner, or maybe do what my mom did. My mom went back and graduated from university at the age of 56 to get more opportunity at her work. Perhaps she could go back to school. She's relatively near Centennial College and University of Toronto, Scarborough, and upgrade her qualifications so she could have one full-time job. Maybe. But that's the transformative power of transit and the transformative power of a proper climate plan, which is what Toronto's did. And by the way, Toronto's greenhouse gas emissions as a geographic entity, not just the city government, are 33% below what they were in 1990, despite the incredible boom that's gone on there for the last 30 years. So it is possible, it's actually possible to make enough change to reduce emissions, keep to 1.5 degrees, and do it in a way that builds better cities and better societies. So there is hope. The sad truth is we need to act today. There's no time to delay anymore. But I hope I've shown that it still might be possible, because that's certainly my belief. And I really appreciate your time and attention. I look forward to questions, conversation, anything else. Thank you.
We do have plenty of time for questions. If anyone has any, raise your hand.
Do you want to?
No, you can go ahead.
I'll go to the third row and then the second row, if that's okay.
Thank you for that great presentation. Like you, yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity and innovation in cities, and I think you explained those well. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about suburbs, because I think, you know, in many places or most metropolitan areas or cities writ large, the suburbs are kind of included. But I think suburban areas, given the way they've been developed, there just have there's a tougher challenge there. You touched on a little bit about sprawl and just the nature of development, and there's kind of a baked-in land use in a lot of these suburbs, where I think both from the buildings perspective, but particularly from transportation, it's a tougher challenge than more dense kind of urban compact areas that we have here in Victoria or, you know, central Toronto. And certainly I think you're probably aware that you know, the population growth in Canada, in larger Canadian cities, is primarily in those suburban areas, partly because of affordability and various other things. So I just wonder if you can comment on, and I know you know, other observers, urban observers like Brenton area and stuff, say, you know, the biggest opportunity, but also the biggest challenge is to kind of fix the suburbs. So I just wonder if you can comment on that.
Well, I think most of the lessons drawn from big cities can be applied in suburbs with one exception, which is suburbs have been built in a way that the transportation network doesn't work. It's a failure. It's a failure of planning, it's a failure of everything else. And parenthetically, in Ontario, they're about to pave over thousands of acres of farmland to create more sprawl. It's just incredibly backwards. So I think the first thing is, we have to think about suburbs using the same kind of analytical framework. Where are the opportunities to lower emissions? And it's going to start with buildings. And I haven't analyzed this, but my intuitive belief, because of the way a lot of suburbs were built, i.e. pretty cheaply, that there is really significant potential for lowering emissions from buildings, particularly single-family homes. There are certain political challenges because people don't believe they're going to own their home long enough to get the money back. There's ways around that. You attach the financing of the property taxes so the next owner has to pay it. It's pretty simple things, but that's the first thing. The second thing is, where you can, suburbs need to be densified and made more city-like through 15-minute city kinds of initiatives. It's not always possible. If you think, one of the challenges, I think, in Great Victoria is geography. It'd be pretty hard to build light rail transit in Langford. So what do you do about that? And I think you have to really think in suburban areas in particular about the electrification of transport as a much higher priority. I haven't highlighted it in my presentation because I really believe that it's the first priority is to make cities walkable in places that are vibrant, that people enjoy living, and they don't need to have a car, so they use a car less. But in a Langford or Houston, it's much more important to seriously transform the transportation to electric vehicles than it is in a Toronto or downtown Victoria, because you have other solutions. So those would be the two places I'd start. We've got to stop building them that way. That would be nice. Yes, sir.
Well, thank you so much for your comments. Very inspiring what you're doing with that group, and it gives us all hope. So congratulations for taking this on as aggressively as you have. One thing you touched upon, but that I've wondered about, and that is that transportation within a city is, of course, a major challenge, and you pointed out all the reasons why we can do that. But there's transportation between cities, and air transportation currently contributes something on the order of 5 to 10% of all greenhouse gas emissions, and is charted to continue to grow. I don't think we're going to get rid of air transportation anytime soon. Europeans have taught us how to use electric trains. They're very effective in that country. What do we do in North America? We have such enormous land masses, huge amounts of intercity communications, often by air. This seems to be a very long-term challenge, and you talked about the urgency to act now. So what would be how can the city mayors help in that topic?
Well, it's an interesting question, because that is a place that's a bit analogous to ports, where very few mayors have jurisdiction. LaGuardia is a city airport, but that's pretty rare. In fact, parenthetically, when I was in office in Toronto, we had one appointee to the Pearson Airport board that was like 50 people. We had one, it's the city, and they wouldn't let us name our choice. They said, we get to pick them. And I said, not when I'm mayor. And we had a big fight. We didn't have a representative for 3 years because they wouldn't let us pick them, and they finally backed down. I'm not quite as forthcoming about the things I screwed up, by the way. But so it is a place where mayors can enact indirect influence, and we're actually having some discussions. There's a group of airports that are trying to take this seriously, and C40 is an organization that's having some discussions about that. It's more about green fuels. I don't find that persuasive, to be honest. Planes require jet fuel. So how do we address it? Well, I think, one, we need to find ways to sort of get rid of short-haul flights. And the studies show that it's takeoff and landing in particular when most emissions occur. So short-haul flights are really bad. And that's certainly possible if you think about the Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, Windsor, Quebec City, Calgary, Edmonton. It's very possible to replace that by train. Proper fast trains, and VIA has a plan, actually. The government's studying it. They've been studying it my lifetime. We moved to Canada in 1967, they've been studying it all the time. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I do think we need to build on the culture that's happened during COVID, when people have figured out you don't always have to go somewhere. That cultural change can be important. So those are two thoughts. They're not fully adequate, but I think starting with the short-haul flights is a really important part of it. And I'm a bit surprised, actually, that Ottawa hasn't done more of that. And I think you could see some cities or mayors in a lot of jurisdictions starting to say, why are we having short-haul flights? Not just because of the environmental impact, but because a lot of the airports they fly into are in the middle of cities. And the highest and best use for that land is something else other than short-haul flights.
I just remember when you said this, that I think in Europe, there is an action right now that's going to ban or prohibit flights that can take a passenger from point A to point B, where there's an equivalent train ride that does the whole thing in 2 hours. In other words, if you add up all the time between getting to the airport, flying, getting out of the airport, linking it just to a train, if the two things are equal, it prohibits that flight between those two cities and forces one to use trains. I think there's some company, you probably know more about that than I do, but I've heard something to that effect.
I don't know more about it than you do. I've heard something to that effect. I think it's only a proposal. But it's interesting, and it's like other things. If we really need long-haul flights for justifiable reasons, well, think of it in the climate budget perspective. Okay, we're using up our plane carbon, so we shouldn't be using them for other things. And I don't know if we'll see that. I mean, maybe, as carbon taxes rise, maybe that'll be an implication. But to me, that would be the place to start. Well, I'm more than happy to be let off the leash after a couple of questions. So I'm not going to extort questions from people. I really appreciate people coming. You've got a new and vibrant, energetic council in Victoria. I don't know the councillors particularly well, but I do understand that pretty much all of them are really committed to these issues. And one of the reasons that Jill and I bought a place here and spend most of our time in Victoria now is because of the tremendous environmental sensibility here and the fact that you can live a very active outdoor lifestyle. People love that, we love that, and I think Victoria can be a real leader globally. And when you see things like the hamburger place in Cook Street Village thinking about its carbon emissions and paying a fair wage to its workers, that's a moral statement that's really powerful, and we should all be proud that we're in a place that makes those moral statements. So thank you for your part in that, and thanks for coming tonight and all your time, attention, and questions. Thank you.